Three Fortune 500 companies just lost the Filipino market overnight after snubbing Eala's sponsorship proposal. Billions in projected revenue vanished as consumers across the Philippines coordinated the most devastating boycott in Southeast Asian sports history. What started as corporate executives dismissing a rising tennis star because she didn't fit their demographic profile escalated into a masterclass in underestimating consumer power, cultural pride, and the consequences of disrespecting someone an entire nation had adopted as their champion. The fallout would reshape how global brands calculate risk in emerging markets. Eala's management team had assembled a compelling sponsorship proposal targeting multinational corporations with significant presence in Southeast Asian markets. The pitch was strategic. Eala represented authentic connection to Filipino consumers and broader regional demographics that Western brands struggled to reach. Her story, rising from public courts to professional tennis, overcoming infrastructure limitations, representing a nation with minimal tennis history, embodied aspirational narratives that resonated powerfully in emerging markets. Three companies received detailed presentations: Global Bev, a beverage conglomerate with dominant market share across Asia; AutoNation, an automotive manufacturer expanding aggressively in Southeast Asian middle-class markets; and TechCorp, a consumer electronics giant seeking to establish brand loyalty among younger Asian demographics. All three had invested billions establishing operations in the Philippines, recognizing the country's economic growth trajectory and consumer purchasing power. Eala's team proposed partnerships structured around her cultural significance, rather than just athletic performance. The beverage company could position her in campaigns about perseverance and achievement. The automotive brand could leverage her journey as metaphor for upward mobility their target customers aspired toward. The tech company could connect her digital native generation appeal to product launches aimed at Southeast Asian youth markets. The proposals included market research demonstrating Eala's recognition rates in the Philippines exceeded 90%, that her achievements generated national pride, translating into consumer affinity for brands she endorsed. The financial asks were modest compared to what these corporations paid athletes from traditional tennis powers. Eala's team requested mid-six-figure annual deals, meaningful money for her, but negligible in corporate marketing budgets measured in hundreds of millions. The proposals emphasized that early investment in Eala's rising profile offered opportunity to establish authentic partnerships before her market value escalated further, that brands supporting her now would benefit from consumer goodwill that couldn't be purchased later at any price. All three companies declined. The rejections arrived within weeks of each other, each using similar corporate language about strategic priorities and current roster obligations and limited budget availability. The responses were polite, professional, and entirely standard for sponsorship rejections that happen constantly in sports marketing. Athletes get told no far more often than yes. Eala's team was disappointed but unsurprised. This was part of building a career, accepting that not every opportunity would materialize. What nobody knew at the time was that internal communications at these companies told a different story than the polite rejection letters suggested. Executives had dismissed Eala's proposals with casual condescension, questioning whether a player ranked outside the top 50 deserved consideration regardless of cultural significance, suggesting that Filipino market consumers weren't valuable enough demographics to justify sports marketing investments, and expressing skepticism that regional athletes could deliver returns comparable to established Western stars. These internal discussions reflected biases that multinational corporations rarely acknowledged publicly but frequently operated on privately. Assumptions that emerging markets represented secondary priorities, that athletes from developing nations lacked global appeal, and that cultural significance in countries like the Philippines mattered less than recognition in Western markets where executives lived and worked. The emails and meeting notes documenting these discussions were confidential, protected by corporate privacy, never intended for external audiences. But in the digital age, confidentiality is fragile, and disgruntled employees with access to damaging communications sometimes decide that transparency serves higher purposes than loyalty. What happened when those internal communications leaked would transform a routine sponsorship rejection into the most expensive corporate miscalculation in Southeast Asian sports marketing history. The leak originated from Global Bev's regional marketing division, where a Filipino employee who'd advocated internally for the Eala partnership had watched executives dismiss the proposal with language that crossed from business judgment into cultural disrespect. The employee compiled email chains and meeting transcripts documenting how decision-makers had discussed Eala's sponsorship request, then anonymously posted them to Filipino social media platforms where they would generate maximum visibility. The communications revealed executives describing Eala as a regional player without global relevance, questioning whether Philippine market consumers justify investment in local sports figures, and suggesting that sponsorship dollars should target athletes who resonate in markets that actually matter to our bottom line. One particularly damaging email chain included an executive joking about whether Filipinos even played tennis or just watched basketball, displaying ignorance about the sport's growing popularity and Eala's significance in expanding its cultural footprint. AutoNation's leaked documents showed similar patterns. Marketing directors had debated whether Filipino consumers represented sufficiently valuable demographics, with one executive writing that the company should focus sponsorship spending on aspirational markets rather than developing economies where brand loyalty follows price rather than prestige. The implication was clear. Filipino consumers were viewed as bargain hunters, unworthy of premium marketing investments, despite the company's aggressive expansion in Philippine automotive markets, where they'd been happy to take consumer money without respecting those consumers enough to support their cultural icons. TechCorp's internal communications were perhaps most damaging because they'd recently launched major campaigns emphasizing global inclusion and celebrating diversity. Yet emails showed executives dismissing Eala specifically because she represented a demographic they considered peripheral to their brand identity. One marketing vice president had written that sponsoring Eala would dilute our association with tennis excellence, and suggested they should pursue partnerships with European or American players who align with the premium positioning we're trying to establish in Asian markets. The leaked materials spread across Filipino social media platforms with viral velocity. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, every channel exploded with outrage as millions of Filipinos read how multinational corporations they'd supported with their purchases and loyalty privately viewed them as secondary markets unworthy of respect. The anger wasn't just about rejecting Eala's sponsorship. It was about the casual contempt displayed towards Filipino consumers, the assumption that developing markets deserved less consideration than Western audiences, and the hypocrisy of companies that eagerly took Filipino money while dismissing Filipino cultural pride. Influencers with millions of combined followers began posting about the leaked communications, translating corporate jargon into plain language that made the disrespect unmistakable. Journalists picked up the story, framing it as evidence of ongoing discrimination against athletes and consumers from developing nations. Sports commentators noted the irony of companies rejecting Eala while spending millions sponsoring Western athletes with less cultural impact in the markets where these corporations sought growth. Within 48 hours, what had started as anonymous leaks had become the dominant story across Filipino media. Television news programs devoted segments to analyzing the communications. Newspapers ran editorials condemning corporate attitudes toward Philippine consumers. Radio hosts took calls from angry listeners, sharing their own experiences with multinational companies that treated Filipino customers as afterthoughts, despite depending on their business. And then, something remarkable happened. The outrage began organizing into coordinated action that would cost these three companies billions. The boycott that followed would demonstrate that Filipino consumers weren't secondary markets. They were a force powerful enough to destroy corporate quarterly earnings across entire Southeast Asian operations. The boycott emerged organically from grassroots fury rather than top-down organizing, which made it more authentic and ultimately more devastating than corporate crisis management teams anticipated. Filipino consumers didn't need professional activists or formal organizations to coordinate their response. Social media provided all the infrastructure necessary to transform individual anger into collective economic power. Within 72 hours of the leaks going viral, hashtags promoting boycotts of all three companies were trending nationwide. Hashtag Boycott Global Bev, Ditch Auto Nation, and Delete Tech Corp accumulated millions of posts as Filipinos shared photos and videos of themselves disposing of products, canceling orders, and switching to competitors. The movement emphasized pride rather than mere protest. This wasn't just about punishing companies that had disrespected Eala. It was about demonstrating that Filipino consumers controlled purchasing decisions and wouldn't tolerate being treated as second-tier markets. Retail workers reported empty aisles where Global Bev products previously dominated. Grocery stores across Manila, Cebu, and Davao watched inventory sit untouched as consumers deliberately chose competitor beverages. Store managers frantically contacted distributors as products approached expiration dates without moving. The beverage company's regional sales collapsed, not gradually, but immediately, as if someone had flipped a switch that turned Filipino consumers away from brands they'd purchased habitually for years. Auto Nation dealerships experienced even more dramatic impacts. Showroom traffic vanished overnight, sales representatives sat idle as potential customers who'd scheduled appointments canceled en masse. Filipinos who'd been saving for years to afford new vehicles chose competitors specifically to participate in the boycott, posting about their purchasing decisions on social media to encourage others. The automotive brand had invested hundreds of millions establishing distribution networks and service centers across the Philippines, betting on rising middle-class demand. Those investments now generated losses as inventory accumulated and financing offers went unclaimed. Tech Corp faced coordinated attacks on multiple fronts. Individual consumers returned products within warranty periods, citing any minor defects to exercise return rights en masse. Enterprise clients canceled pending contracts for IT infrastructure worth tens of millions, citing reputational concerns and pressure from employees who refused to work with companies that had disrespected national pride. University student organizations passed resolutions banning Tech Corp products from campus stores. Government procurement officers quietly redirected orders to competitors, unwilling to face backlash for supporting companies that insulted Filipino dignity. The boycott spread beyond the Philippines as Filipino diaspora communities worldwide participated. Millions of Filipino overseas workers sent remittances home while simultaneously refusing to purchase products from the three targeted companies in their host countries. The movement demonstrated that Filipino consumer power extended globally, that communities maintaining strong cultural connections would support collective action even when geographically dispersed. Other Southeast Asian nations joined the boycott as the leaked communications resonated with consumers who recognized similar attitudes toward their own markets. Indonesians, Malaysians, Vietnamese, and Thai consumers saw themselves in the dismissive corporate language about developing economies and regional markets. What had started as Filipino outrage evolved into broader Southeast Asian solidarity, expanding the boycott's economic impact far beyond what the three companies had anticipated. Corporate executives initially dismissed the boycott as a temporary emotional reaction that would fade once media attention moved elsewhere. They'd weathered controversies before, knew that consumer memory was short, assumed that discounts and advertising campaigns would eventually restore purchasing patterns. But this time was different. The quarterly earnings reports that followed revealed just how catastrophically these companies had miscalculated Filipino consumer power. Global Bev's quarterly earnings call 3 months after the boycott began was a bloodbath. The company's Asia-Pacific division reported revenue declines of 73% in Philippine markets, with similar double-digit drops across Southeast Asian operations, where the boycott had spread. Analysts peppered executives with questions about how a sponsorship rejection could trigger such catastrophic financial consequences. The CEO's explanations, blaming temporary market volatility and coordinated misinformation campaigns, satisfied nobody. Wall Street punished the stock, wiping out billions in market capitalization as investors recognized that the company had fundamentally misunderstood consumer dynamics in markets critical to their growth strategy. The beverage company's challenges extended beyond immediate sales losses. Distributors across the Philippines canceled contracts, unwilling to warehouse products nobody would purchase. Retail partners demanded discounts to clear existing inventory, forcing Global Bev to accept losses on products already shipped. Marketing campaigns designed to rebuild brand affinity failed spectacularly, as Filipino consumers rejected advertisements they interpreted as insincere attempts to recover profits rather than genuine apologies. Focus groups revealed that the boycott had transformed from protest into identity. Refusing Global Bev products had become a point of cultural pride that transcended the initial controversy. AutoNation's situation was even worse because automotive purchases represent major long-term investments that create ongoing service relationships. The company hadn't just lost current sales, they'd lost future revenue for maintenance, parts, and eventual replacement purchases from customers who'd now established relationships with competitors. Dealerships across the Philippines faced closure as operating costs exceeded revenue. The automotive brand had planned aggressive expansion in Southeast Asian markets, projecting that rising middle-class incomes would drive decades of growth. Those projections now looked laughably optimistic, as the boycott demonstrated that growth required consumer goodwill that couldn't be manufactured through advertising alone. Financial analysts studying the crisis identified a fundamental miscalculation in how these companies had assessed emerging market risk. They'd assessed Filipino consumers through purely economic metrics, income levels, purchasing power, market size, without considering cultural factors that could transform consumer behavior overnight. The leaked communications insulted not just Eala, but Filipino national pride, triggering responses that traditional risk models couldn't predict or quantify. Credit rating agencies downgraded all three companies, citing exposure to emerging market volatility and demonstrated inability to navigate cultural sensitivities in regions critical to their growth strategy. The downgrades increased borrowing costs, further compounding financial damage from the boycott itself. Desperate to stop the bleeding, all three companies would attempt damage control that revealed just how badly they had misunderstood what Filipino consumers actually wanted. Global Bev's apology came first, released through full-page newspaper advertisements and social media campaigns across the Philippines. The statement acknowledged that internal communications had reflected attitudes incompatible with the company's stated values, announced termination of executives whose comments had been leaked, and pledged $50 million toward Filipino sports development programs. Most significantly, they offered Eala an endorsement deal worth $5 million annually, 10 times what her original proposal had requested, positioning the partnership as evidence of renewed commitment to Philippine markets. Filipino consumers rejected the gesture immediately. Social media exploded with criticism framing the apology as transparently mercenary, an attempt to purchase forgiveness rather than demonstrate genuine respect. Eala herself declined the endorsement offer publicly, stating that she couldn't accept partnerships from companies that had insulted her and Filipino consumers until she saw sustained evidence of changed attitudes rather than crisis management tactics. Her refusal became a rallying point for boycott participants, proof that this movement wasn't about extracting corporate money, but about demanding fundamental respect. AutoNation's approach was more elaborate. They fired their entire Philippine marketing leadership, appointed a Filipino executive to lead regional operations, and announced plans to establish a manufacturing facility in the Philippines that would create thousands of jobs. The strategy aimed to demonstrate long-term commitment beyond superficial apologies. But labor unions investigating the manufacturing announcement discovered it was a facility already planned before the controversy, simply reframed and announced with timing designed to capitalize on the boycott. When this deception was exposed, consumer anger intensified rather than subsided. TechCorp pursued a different strategy, attempting to position themselves as victims of employee misconduct rather than acknowledging institutional attitudes. Their public relations campaign emphasized that the leaked emails represented individual opinions rather than company policy, that they'd terminated the employees responsible, and that their commitment to diversity and inclusion was demonstrated through hiring practices and charitable initiatives. The defensive messaging backfired spectacularly, as Filipino consumers interpreted it as refusing accountability, blaming low-level employees for attitudes that clearly reflected broader corporate culture. All three companies offered Eala lucrative sponsorship deals as part of their damage control efforts. The combined value exceeded $20 million annually, astronomical compensation that would have made her one of tennis's highest-paid endorsers despite her ranking. But Eala rejected all three offers, explaining that accepting would validate the company's assumption that Filipino loyalty could be purchased, that enough money would make consumers forget the disrespect embedded in those leaked communications. Her refusals generated massive support across the Philippines. She became a symbol not just of athletic achievement, but of refusing to compromise dignity for financial gain. The boycott intensified as consumers recognized that even the athletes supposedly harmed by the company's actions wouldn't accept their money, that this wasn't a negotiation where sufficient compensation could resolve grievances. Competitors who'd treated Filipino markets with respect capitalized ruthlessly. Beverage brands that had supported local athletes launched campaigns highlighting their long-standing Philippine commitments. Automotive companies that had invested in Filipino communities emphasized their partnerships with local organizations. Tech firms that had respected Southeast Asian consumers gained massive market share as boycott participants needed alternative products. The crisis wasn't just destroying the three targeted companies, it was permanently redistributing market share to competitors who demonstrated values alignment with Filipino cultural priorities. A year into the boycott, all three companies had replaced executive leadership, restructured regional operations, and invested hundreds of millions in Philippine market recovery initiatives. None of it mattered. The boycott continued with sustained intensity that defied every precedent in consumer activism. What business schools would later study about this case was how it permanently altered corporate calculations about emerging market risks and the true cost of cultural disrespect. 18 months after the leaked communications sparked the boycott, Harvard Business School published a case study titled The Eala Effect: When Cultural Disrespect Destroys Market Value. The analysis became required reading in MBA programs worldwide as an example of catastrophic failure to understand emerging market dynamics, consumer psychology, and the risks of treating developing nations as secondary priorities, despite depending on their revenue. The case documented how all three companies never recovered their Philippine market positions. Global Bev's share of the beverage market had been permanently redistributed to competitors, with Filipino consumers maintaining their boycott even after the initial outrage faded from headlines. Brand tracking studies showed that negative associations with the company had become embedded in cultural memory, passed between generations as a cautionary tale about foreign corporations that disrespected national pride. The beverage giant eventually sold its Philippine operations at a massive loss, exiting a market they'd once dominated. AutoNation's experience was similarly devastating. Their Philippine dealership network, once the country's second largest, contracted by 60%. The automotive brand attempted relaunching with new models and aggressive pricing, but Filipino consumers refused to forget. Industry analysts calculated total losses exceeding $2 billion when accounting for abandoned infrastructure investments, lost future earnings, and damage to the company's reputation across Southeast Asian markets where the boycott's lessons resonated. Tex Corp faced the longest recovery timeline because their products involved complex ecosystems that made switching particularly difficult. Yet, Filipino consumers proved willing to bear those costs, migrating to competitors despite losing data, repurchasing accessories, and learning new platforms. The tech company's Southeast Asian market share projected to drive 30% of global growth over the next decade, instead stagnated as the Eala boycott became a template for consumer activism across the region. Business schools analyzing the case identified several critical failures. First, the companies had evaluated markets purely through economic metrics, without considering cultural factors that could override traditional consumer behavior models. Second, they'd assumed that developing market consumers lacked the organizational capacity or sustained commitment to maintain long-term boycotts. Third, they fundamentally misunderstood that in emerging economies where national pride is actively constructed through cultural achievements, insulting those achievements triggers responses far more intense than similar controversies in established markets. The case studies noted that Eala eventually signed sponsorship deals with companies that had recognized her value from the beginning, partnerships worth collectively $15 million annually, astronomical compensation that would have made her one of tennis's highest-paid endorsers despite her ranking. But Eala rejected all three offers, explaining that accepting would validate the company's assumption that Filipino loyalty could be purchased, that enough money would make consumers forget the disrespect embedded in those leaked communications. Her refusals generated massive support across the Philippines. She became a symbol not just of athletic achievement, but of refusing to compromise dignity for financial gain. The boycott intensified as consumers recognized that even the athletes supposedly harmed by the company's actions wouldn't accept their money, that this wasn't a negotiation where sufficient compensation could resolve grievances. Competitors who'd treated Filipino markets with respect capitalized ruthlessly. Beverage brands that had supported local athletes launched campaigns highlighting their long-standing Philippine commitments. Automotive companies that had invested in Filipino communities emphasized their partnerships with local organizations. Tech firms that had respected Southeast Asian consumers gained massive market share as boycott participants needed alternative products. The crisis wasn't just destroying the three targeted companies, it was permanently redistributing market share to competitors who demonstrated values alignment with Filipino cultural priorities. A year into the boycott, all three companies had replaced executive leadership, restructured regional operations, and invested hundreds of millions in Philippine market recovery initiatives. None of it mattered. The boycott continued with sustained intensity that defied every precedent in consumer activism. What business schools would later study about this case was how it permanently altered corporate calculations about emerging market risks and the true cost of cultural disrespect. 18 months after the leaked communications sparked the boycott, Harvard Business School published a case study titled The Eala Effect: When Cultural Disrespect Destroys Market Value. The analysis became required reading in MBA programs worldwide as an example of catastrophic failure to understand emerging market dynamics, consumer psychology, and the risks of treating developing nations as secondary priorities, despite depending on their revenue. The case documented how all three companies never recovered their Philippine market positions. Global Bev's share of the beverage market had been